are in the world right now, hello. I hope all is well with you. My name is Joseph. I am a language arts teacher at the American School of Doha in Qatar. I'm also one of the two equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice officers at my school. Now that my intro is out of the way, let's get into it. Let's talk about being a better assistant coach and having your students be more of the coach in their own learning. If you look on the screen, you'll see a QR code. The QR code will take you to the Apple App Store where you can download the Nike Run Club app. I've been running for a few years now, and pretty soon after I start running, I start using this app, the Nike Run Club app. Now, the global head coach goes by the name of Coach Bennett, and you'll hear me talking about Coach Bennett, about the Nike Run Club app, about running, and also not about running. So when I talk about the Nike Run Club app and talk about myself and running, stick with me. I'll get to the part about how this translates to being a better coach, assistant coach, and teacher. But first, a little more about the app. On the app, when you put in your run, you'll see a place where you can reflect, and you can reflect on the effort, where you ran, and even other notes you have for yourself along the way. And reflection really is the glue. I'll come back to this later on, but reflection is the glue about how the run went while you're running, and after the run, how you can become a stronger runner on your next run and on your future runs. A little more about the app. You can download guided runs, short runs, 1 minute long runs, distant runs, marathon runs, speed runs, recovery runs, you name it. There are all these guided runs that you can download for your phone or your watch. Along the way, Coach Bennett, well, he coaches. And one thing he often says is something important, something that's been important to me about coaching. And what Coach Bennett will say is this. He will say that he is really the assistant coach, that you, the runner, is the real coach. We schedule the run, we make the plans, we decide how long the run will go. We decide the intensity of the run, and we are the ones that must reflect on how the run went. That idea of being the assistant coach has transferred to my teaching, and that's what I would like to share with you today. What I'm hoping to share is that by moving from being the coach to being the assistant coach, we can empower our students to be the head coach, to be the head coach for one another. Now, in the spirit of interaction, this session will have three main parts to it. There'll be a time when I introduce some idea about being an assistant coach to you, a time when I'm hoping that you'll try it, and then a time that I'm hoping you'll reflect on how that went. So introduce, try, reflect. Now, if you have your phone or iPad handy, please use it. If you scan that QR code you see right there, it will take you to a Padlet, the image of the Padlet you see on the left-hand side of the screen, and that's where I'm hoping that you can reflect on how these three parts of the session went. And if you have any questions there, you can post them. I will come back and look at this Padlet and I'll be happy to respond to any questions that are there. And it's a chance for you to communicate with one another, with other people that are taking this session as well. So it'll be a place for us to co-create meaning out of this work and help one another to make the work stronger. Once you've heard my thinking about how we can move from being the coach to an assistant coach and empowering our students to being more of the coach for themselves and coach for one another, let's go into how this session is going to go. I'm hoping that it's going to feel interactive. And so if you didn't grab your phone or iPad before, please go grab it now. You're going to need it to scan some codes that show up along the way. Ready? Let's get started. So what I'm hoping to do, what I'd like to do is take a little bit of time to share how through reflection and feedback, we can support our students as they become the coaches for their own learning, and we become more of the assistant coach, giving them the guidance and support that they need. This session will have two main parts. It's about reflection and feedback, focusing on three different items: the story of my year as a dot dot dot, the ladder of feedback, and thin slicing. Now, I know that right about now, some of you have conflicting emotions, conflicting opinions about Twitter, about staying on Twitter, about using Twitter. Still, I want to give people their flowers when they're deserved. So, if you're on Twitter, go follow Marcus Luther. This idea of telling the story of a year through reflections on assessments, reflections on work, any kind of work really, in two ways, reflecting on both the process and the results puts the student in the driver's seat. It makes them the coach by thinking about how the work went, really how the work is going. And then after receiving some feedback, it gets them to coach themselves in thinking about how the work went and what they can do going forward, how they can transfer what they've done. So this is the flow of how it goes. There are four components to it. Here are the first two. They complete the work. And really, as I think about this, they can do this in middle of the work. So I'm thinking about it while I'm saying it to you, that they can complete the work or work on the work. How about that? And then during this time, they can reflect on their process, um, how they feel it went, and what they invested into the work that they produced or are producing. Then the student received feedback, maybe from you, preferably from a student, so they're co-coaching. And then they complete the second part of the story of the year, how they feel about the results, including the feedback. What is their takeaway? That's where you get into transfer. That's where you get into how is this going to help them down the road? How is it going to help them into in different classes they have and in different times of the year. And for me, after students receive the feedback, they're doing this reflecting. And it's for me, it's our next steps as a reader, writer, listener, and speaker. So here's what it looks like in practice. I use Google Classroom to make and send a form that already had some of the assessments on it. I did have to make some changes along the way, but I fixed this by making the changes on the documents myself and by showing them the changes and having them make the changes themselves. So you know your student, you know the tech savviness, you know your context, and so know that I've tried both ways and both ways worked. You can use the QR code there on the left-hand side to get a copy of the form for yourself. And you'll see that this student filled in the space with their writing. Now, not every student will fill the entire space that you give them, but with a constant focus on process and reflection on one document, even your students who don't have a lot to say, who don't always have a lot to say, are the coach when it comes to their own progress. And it really is a way for them to connect their different work together, and the reflection is the glue that ties that all together, just like it did for me, my running, and on the app. So we're about to go into the try it phase. On the try it phase, I'm hoping that you will download this form, you'll play with it a little bit, changing the fonts, changing the colors, to see how you can make it work for you. So my big takeaway from thinking through the story of my year as a reader, writer, listener, and speaker was three parts really. And part one was just how much better it was having all of the reflections in one place. In the past, I had reflections attached to this document, attached to this assessment, somewhere in their notebook, and it was hard to see the thread of how they were changing over time, how they were getting better over time. So that was thing one. Thing two, just like you see an example from Marcus Luther, it really does make conferences stronger. What I ended up doing was projecting the document on the screen during conference, and if the student was there, the child was there, we talked about something that they were proud of, a strength of their work. If they weren't, then I just chose something, but they were talking about their process and their feedback, and they were moving from strength to strength. So that was the second way that this really worked for me. And the third way was that it really kept me organized in my assessment. So I was thinking through, okay, how is this assessment going to go? How is this assessment going to go? How is this reflection going to go? So I was thinking through the assessment reflection at the beginning of the unit, at the beginning of planning the assessment. So it really brought for me the reflection closer to the assessment. It put me in the role of that assistant coach, right? So it was me thinking about how am I going to help them help themselves get better. So those are the three ways that this story of my year helped me become a stronger assistant coach. The second way to become a better assistant coach, to give your students a way to provide meaningful feedback. Now, this ladder of feedback comes from Project Zero out of the Harvard Grad School of Education. If you go to the site listed there, pz.harvard.edu, you'll find lots of resources you can use in your class. The ladder of feedback is one of them. And don't worry if you missed it, there'll be a chance for you to find this link a little bit later. As stated on the Students at the Center website, this is adapted from Daniel Wilson's Ladder of Feedback for Classroom Observations. The Ladder of Feedback is a protocol or structure that establishes a culture of trust and support by sequencing feedback in an order that is constructive. And it really is. I found that for students and for me, sometimes you want to jump to suggestions. You want to jump right to here's what you should, what you shouldn't do. By adding in clarifying and valuing, students are coaching one another with constructive feedback, with constructive, positive feedback, and coaching themselves with being a better listener, to listen first and don't just jump to suggesting. So here are the first few steps, the first steps of that letter of feedback. At the very bottom of the letter, they must clarify. They must ask questions first to make sure they understand what it is they're looking at, what it is they're giving feedback on. And here's the second step is the integral part of the ladder, I believe. But they must say what they value. They must say what it is they liked about the work. And what I coach students into doing is thinking through that sometimes it can be a challenge to find the positive, to find the real positive, not something fake. But there is something there. You can move as a coach from strength to strength, just like in for running, just like in football, just like in track. Coaching is really moving from what can they do well now, and what can they do better based on what they can already do. So coaching students into coaching, that is how you can be a great assistant coach, right? So you're getting them focusing on what is of value and what they can value in that work. After valuing, students then share their concerns and then make suggestions. They must move up the ladder, and I emphasize that a lot, that they must move up the ladder in their work. They can't start with suggestions. They can't start with sharing concerns. You have to clarify before you can suggest. And I've seen this in a few places, but I added this in my own ladder for my own students that must think and reflect. And this thinking and reflecting can be in person. Often it is in person, but then also it can be on the story of my year as a reader, writer, listener, and speaker. So there's multiple ways to think and multiple ways to reflect, but I put that at the top of the ladder so that it gives value to what the person who spent time giving feedback, spent time coaching is saying. It's showing the person giving the feedback that I hear you, I hear what you're saying, and I may not act on all of it because they're really the head coach of their own work, but I hear what you're saying, I acknowledge what you've done, and thank you. I use Padlet to make a space for a digital gallery walk. And a gallery walk is where, in class you would have all the notebooks or work spread out around and people come look at it. I try to make it so we could all do it in one place. So I use Padlet for this digital work. Now, I took pictures of the work myself and uploaded it, but you could just as easily, based on your context, based on what your students can do, have them upload pictures themselves. Now, the students didn't put their names on the work that they submitted, but they had to sign in to give feedback. They had to log into Padlet to get the feedback. And this way, the person giving feedback doesn't know whom they are coaching. Here, the people doing the coaching, giving the feedback, must move up the ladder. And again, I emphasize that they must move up the ladder. And so let's say you and I are doing this work together. You submit the work. I don't know that it's your work, but I give you feedback. You know it's me, so you can come back and ask me questions about this, and so on and so on. And as a side note, you can make up to 3 Padlets for free, and you can archive or convert Padlets to PDFs so that you don't have to delete them. So if you haven't signed up for Padlet, it's a great resource. I hope that you do so. And here's what it looks like. It ends up looking like a wall of work where I can look at all the feedback, that they can see the feedback, they can see mentors that are there. You can specify, well, this is a great piece of feedback you should look at. This is a great work you can look at. But they're coaching one another with positive, constructive feedback. And the person who is receiving the feedback is again their own coach. They're deciding about how they're going to reflect on this. What is their takeaway? What are their own next steps? The latter feedback for me really came out of a difficult conversation that I had to have with another teacher. And so another person was guiding us through this ladder of feedback of how we could respond to one another in a positive, constructive way. And as I left that difficult conversation, I thought this would be a great thing to work with my students. And so, what came out of that was this. And so, working with my students, it really focused on them being constructive. It focused on them being positive. It focused on how they could build one another, build on the strengths that one another have. And so it really moved them from giving feedback, which was hit or miss, sometimes depending on the strength of the person, of the student, to a real formal way of giving structured, targeted, positive feedback by including a part where they had to say where they valued early. It really gave the person who was receiving the feedback something positive to work with. And then they could move on to concerns. But at the end, there were suggestions, but earlier on, there was a part about this is what I didn't really get in your work, but this is what I really liked about what you had done. And I would tell them that even for me, sometimes it's really easy to say, I value this, I value that. And for some people, for some students, it can be more of a challenge, but I look for the good in their work and I look for the strength in their work, and they should too. So that moves them from being sometimes a passive player in giving feedback to giving much more structured coaching advice and looking for the good, which is what you want your coach to do, right? You want your coach to look for the good in what you're doing and help you move from strength to strength. So this was helping them move from strength to strength and helping them coach one another in moving from strength to strength. So that's how this ladder of feedback really changed how I have students give one another feedback in what they do. And it can be for small assessments, it can be for in-process work, and it can be for finished essays. So really this ladder of feedback runs the gamut of how it can be used. The final way to be a better assistant coach is to give your students timely feedback. Maybe you, like me, sit a little too long with the work, making the feedback not as useful, not as powerful as it can be. By thin slicing or focusing on one small part of the work at a time, you can give targeted feedback to your students, giving them the feedback with time for them to act on it. So hopefully, in the middle of the work they're doing, if you think about receiving good coaching, you can receive coach in the middle of something, and you can receive coaching at the end of the thing. So if you're, let's say I'm on a run and I get some coaching halfway through, well, that's going to improve me in that run and the next run. So as a side note here, another side note, you don't have to wait to the end for coaching, and students don't have to wait for the end for coaching. You don't have to wait for the end to get feedback. You can give feedback in the process of the work. Now back to the thin slicing. This work comes from two writing teachers. If you haven't gone to the website, I strongly suggest that you do so. You can see the website there. You can also follow them on Twitter. And those are two ways that you can access this great resource. And here's a QR code that will take you directly to their site. You'll find more information about how they refer to thin slicing, how they explain it. The thin slicing I'm going to do is a little bit different, but the concept I feel is essentially the same of not looking at everything, but looking at a thin slice of it. Now you'll see on the website, I've included the image here of the 5 steps used for thin slicing. I use it in two big ways. One is to efficiently assess essays, and as a way to give feedback on notebook checks. Now for the essay, I'll read the first essay, and then I'll read the second one, chosen at random. I'll skim it, ask myself, is it stronger or less strong than the first essay? Then I'll skim all the rest of the essay, sorting them into 3 different categories: strong, not so strong, needs some help. And now, by thin slicing the essays that way, I've skimmed over all of them, and the feedback I'm going to give is similar. And so I can group students together, that they can be coaches for one another, that I can borrow feedback from one to give another. I'm not jumping from kind of writing to kind of writing. And so it helps me being an assistant coach by making my timeline of processing essays faster. The other way is by looking at their notebooks. And if you're like me, the idea of carrying lots of notebooks can be daunting. Uh, there's just a lot of them, right? And so here's a way to thin slice notebook checks. And this is what I shared with my students. By emphasizing my level of focus for each one, I was also making sure that my feedback was timely. Now, as a side note, I don't take all the notebooks at the same time. I use a random number generator, and you can search for that online, and I choose one table or group at at random. Sometimes I've done it by stickers, so I place different color stickers in our notebooks, and I just choose a color at random as well. So there's lots of ways you can randomize this work. And then I only take that color or I only take that table's notebooks. And so none of us know whose notebooks are being assessed that day. Students are always ready. They have to stay ready. And they like seeing the wheel spinning around. They like seeing the randomness of the colors. Now, this makes me a better assistant coach because I am assessing less work, but I'm assessing it more often. And the feedback I give is actionable since it is the coach slash student getting their work back faster. And even this thin slicing of the work for me tells me, okay, what am I going to spend my time on? And I'm telling them, what am I going to spend my time on when I am looking through their notebooks? What we're about to do after you hear my closing is go into the last of the 3 triads where you can try out this idea of thin slicing or even go back to the other examples if you so choose. If you haven't done so yet, please take a minute to go to the Padlet and add your own reflections or even questions or thoughts about how this work could go. Thin slicing for me really sped up the time of my feedback. It really made me a better assistant coach in this way that by looking at one small thing or a few small things for a few people, I was able to get in this loop of giving more feedback more often. So it seems like a small thing, but it really helped. And with the essays, I can't stress this enough. Reading one essay fast, and then deciding where the essays are compared to the first one. you end up with these three buckets, you know, these three categories of work, and the assessments aren't always the same. Sometimes you have to do some recalibration, but it really did make it so that I was giving targeted feedback and the same kind of feedback. So I could start to say, okay, these groups, these kids are together. I can put them in groups together. Oh, I could use this comment from here for there. I could pair them together and they could coach one another in this work. So by dividing up that work, it really gave me ways that I could put them in the coaching position, ways I could empower them to work with one another. And it just made assessment for me easier. So I wasn't jumping constantly from thing to thing. And when it came to their notebooks, as an LA teacher, if you're an LA teacher, you know that notebooks can be tough to assess. Just carrying them around literally can be heavy. And so by choosing 4 or 5 to look at one time, or really if I have 2 classes in the day, we have a block schedule. If I have 2 classes in the day, maybe 9, but let's say you have 6 classes, let's say you have 8 classes, let's say. So I wouldn't do 4 from each class. Well, let's say you take 2, let's say you have 8 classes and you take 2 from each class. Well, over the course of a semester, you'll get to notebooks at least once, probably twice. So you're giving that constant feedback, but you're also thinking about where can I put this student with this other student? How can I group them together? And so then you're still making the group. So even if you're in my example of 8 classes a day, and bless you, if you have 8 classes in a day that you're teaching English to, thin slicing can be a way that you can focus the work and you're not assessing class notebook after notebook after notebook 30 at a time. It really is a hope trying to get a small number at a time of the work that you are trying to assess. I'd like to leave you with this idea of coaching not being new. It's not. We talked about coaching. You heard about coaching. You have coaches at your school. Some of you are coaches. But the idea of being an assistant coach may be new to you. Moving your position from the head coach to the assistant coach. And however you describe it, putting students in the lead in how they reflect, provide feedback, and can act on the feedback will make for stronger students. And this is about teaching and not about teaching. This is about learning. This is about running and not about running. This is just about ways to help them be better at the things that they care about. Again, maybe your feelings about Twitter have changed over the last few weeks, but here's my Twitter handle. Or if you're looking for someone to cheer you on in your running journey, please join Nike Running Club. Let me know. You can let me know through the Padlet. You can jump on Twitter for just a second and let me know. I'd be happy to support you in your running journey. It's better when you do this work with someone else. So that's it. Short and sweet, a little bit about being a better assistant coach, letting your students, allowing your students, giving them the space to be better coaches. Again, my name is Joseph. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on the Nike Run Club. I look forward to hearing how it went. I look forward to your feedback about how this went. Again, thank you for your time and take care.